Right. I think let's get started. Otherwise, we could be here forever, couldn't we? Knowing our church. Welcome everyone. I think Kate, please could you mute everybody? That'd be great. Thank you. Welcome. I hope you're having a good sunny 1st of November. Can't believe it's November already. And after the joyful news from Boris last night, I thought it would be good to, I think the verse that's been in my mind a lot this week has just been that, you know, Jesus is the light of the world. And that verse from John where it says, the word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. So even though it feels a bit dark with the clocks going back and yesterday it just rained so much, didn't it? So, you know, physically it feels a bit dark. The prospect of lockdown and just all that's going on feels a bit dark, but actually Jesus is the light and the darkness cannot extinguish him. So I thought we could start by just having a think of something that has been good this week, some light from God that has broken through into your week this week, that we could share in breakout rooms, just to lift our eyes up to the one who made heaven and earth, just to help us to focus on him. I think one of the pictures that really struck me once was, if you look at a candle, then all you can see is the light, and the light is really strong. But if you turn around and look at the darkness, then you don't see the light. So actually sometimes we have to be purposeful about looking at the light and saying, thank you, Lord, thank you for all the amazing good things that we have. So Kate's gonna pop us into breakout rooms for a couple of minutes just to share something good, something that we can be thankful for, something that is from Jesus's light from this week. And lovely to see you, Andrea. So Kate, join us. Thank you. Right, well, that was a lightning speed breakout room. So lovely to have a quick chat. So let's just pray for Tim as he comes to talk to us. Father, I just pray that you would be with Tim now as he speaks. Open up our hearts and our ears to hear your voice speaking, that we would hear what you have to say to us this morning. Amen. Tim, are you ready?
I am ready. And what's nice is I've been joined by new people. So I started off on my own, and now Julie's here as well. And we've got like this whole live setup this morning where we've actually got Ethan and Alicia as well. So it's I've got like a little kind of crowd. So I've got a little bit of potential for some heckling, live heckling. And a little bit of live interaction. I think, especially from Alicia and Ethan on the sofa over there, there may well be a bit of heckling this morning. As you know, we're just in a series. The thing that chatting to Debs and Emily a few weeks ago, we thought it'd be really great to have a little think a bit about God's heart of compassion for the poor over this period of a few weeks up until Christmas. And I think what I've been really interested in is the kind of way that I've almost been caught by surprise by how this has sort of taken us into such a whole set of sort of really foundational questions, I guess, much sort of bigger and deeper questions. So naively, there I was, I thought, like Debs and Emily, yeah, let's do a something on God's heart of compassion for the poor. And I thought, well, what's the best way to do that? Let's just go for a kind of quick sprint through the biblical story, sort of from Genesis through to Revelation. Let's do a sort of quick sprint through the Bible. And I kind of felt like at that point, I felt like, oh, I know what I'm going to say. So that this will be a good way to do it. But I think what's really interesting is as you kind of encounter the Bible, and the Bible's this extraordinary book where no matter how many times you read it, it feels like the sort of more you read it, the deeper you go. And there's stuff, I guess, that God flags that's relevant to this present moment. And I really feel like that with this series, is that in some ways I kind of feel like I thought I knew what we'd be talking about, and in a sense it feels like actually what God wants is something else, that is to sort of take us a little bit deeper and to encourage us to do some sort of more foundational reshaping of our lives, individually and as a community of followers of Jesus. So to me, it's been really exciting. So I hope you get a sense of that today as well, of another way where I feel like, oh gosh, I think God's taking us deeper again. So there'll be more homework, I'm afraid, and there'll be more chance to kind of encounter and explore God. But kind of roll with me a little bit, and let's see where we get to. So as you know, if you've been kind of following along, one of the things that we've done in the last few weeks is we've been thinking a little bit about, first of all, an invitation, I guess, to be stewards and not owners. And we started with Genesis, sort of like the best place to start. When you sing, begin with ABC. Or no, that's when you read, isn't it? Don't worry me. When you read the Bible, I guess begin with the Genesis and Exodus story, sort of start right at the beginning. And we thought a little bit a few weeks ago about the fact that the Genesis story is an invitation to think of ourselves as stewards, not owners. Like we talked about the idea that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And so that in many ways reframes the way we think about our time, our emotions, our energy, our resources, our money, that actually we're kind of these stewards of all of this stuff that God's given us. He's freely given and we can freely give. And then we also thought a little bit then, didn't we, about being made in the image of God, about the way that that makes us look at ourselves differently, maybe look at others differently. And in a sense, I think that very much followed on to the stuff we looked at last time when we got into Exodus finally, where we thought about what it means to be a rescued people and not rescuers, that we're not kind of called to be these like amazing people that ride in on a white horse and transform the world. We're actually called to be people who enjoy and experience rescue. And then as a result of that, actually see ourselves and others differently, because I guess that means that we're naturally drawn to those in need of rescue, that as rescued people, we're also, in a sense, our heart is kind of drawn to those who are also in need of rescue. And that was very much the Exodus story, where Israel is brought out of slavery and they end up in this new land. And in a sense, God is saying to them, in some ways, what I want you to do is have this special eye out for those who are also strangers in the land, because you know what it's like to be that, or other people who've experienced slavery. That God says, there's a kind of call to identify, not identify, I guess, with the rich and powerful, but to identify with the poor and marginalized as a result of being a rescued people. And we're going to think today a little bit about law and about what happens when Israel's in this new land. What I want to do is sort of, if you like, take the story on a stage further. We'll get to prophets in a couple of weeks' time. Tom's going to look at the prophets and what the prophets have to say all about this, and then we'll get finally into the New Testament and Jesus. But I thought it'd be worth pausing to think about this people in this new land that they've been given, and in a sense, what do we see from that part of the story about God's heart for the poor and God's heart of compassion for the poor. The one thing I think that's super interesting about Genesis and Exodus, actually there's loads that's interesting about Genesis and Exodus, but one thing I think that's really interesting and is a kind of thread that runs through them is the idea of Sabbath. So back in that Genesis story, there's this sense, isn't there, of God making everything and then resting. And God brings work and rest, this kind of rhythm, this cycle of work and rest, into play within that narrative. And Sabbath is incredibly important within the Exodus story, because I think what you find with Sabbath is that Sabbath is a gift to a slave people and ex-slave people. Because if you understand, the bits that we looked at within the Exodus story, when Israel cries out and God hears their cry and acts on their behalf, and God sees the slavery that they're reduced to, one of the things that he sees a people who toil, who don't just work and rest, but toil all the time. And in a sense, what God does is he kind of invites Israel into this experience of a rhythm of work and rest. And so one of the things that is instituted very early for this new people is that they're called to rest, and they're invited to share Sabbath rest every seventh day to rest like God rests. And I've always felt like that's a kind of way in which they're almost like reprogrammed from being slaves to being free people, because slaves don't experience rest. Slaves, in a sense, are kind of forced to toil and labor. And God is saying, in many ways, I think he's reshaping Israel's identity. He's saying, no, you're no longer slaves. Actually, what I'm inviting you to do is to be a people of rest. And that's very much what I kind of want us to focus on, is to think about Sabbath, because I want us to just look at one text, which is in Leviticus 25, which is where God extends this idea of Sabbath from the people to the land as well. There's this extraordinary moment in Leviticus 25 where you get, in a sense, God's kind of plan for how he wants a bit of sort of like land management to take place within this new land. And you'll see real echoes here, I think, of that stuff we've thought about already with the Genesis narrative, where we've got a real sense that actually God's calling people to steward rather than own the land. And that sense of that being part of the Genesis story, I think, re-echoes as Israel, if you like, occupies this land and lives in this land. And there's this like wonderful moment, I think, in Leviticus where God extends his injunction, his call for his people to take Sabbath rest, and he applies it to the land. Leviticus 25 verses 2-6 I've put up here, where he says, when you've entered the land I'm giving you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath rest before the Lord every 7th year. There's this idea that Israel is to let all of the land lie fallow for an entire year every 7 years. And that rather than tilling the soil during that 7th year and planting seed and then harvesting the seed, Israel is invited instead just to kind of gather whatever does grow, and to let others gather whatever grows. So whatever kind of grows naturally, I guess, without the toil of humans. Just imagine what that 7th year is like. So you get a whole year off in 7, 1 in 7. I mean, that's like the true Sabbath and true sabbatical, isn't it? So 6 years, you work your guts out, toiling and working the land. And then you get a year where you just sit back and the land does its own kind of thing. And you have a year of rest, a year where the land produces what it produces because it's kind of like someone else has taken over. It's like God himself has taken over. This owner of the land has taken over. And on that 7th year, you kind of like sit back and just watch what happens in your vineyards and watch what happens in your fields. And you eat whatever is produced by the land. And the thing that's interesting, I think, about this story, and we'll say a bit more about this because it sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? And in many ways, it is too good to be true. Israel immediately has a bit of a problem with this idea of that kind of Sabbath, which isn't just taking one day off in 7, but taking 1 year off in 7 and having a year, whereas an agricultural community, you just kind of chill. You sort of chillax for an entire year and don't do the normal toil of agricultural labor, and you just kind of let the land sit there and do its own thing, and you eat what's on the land. But there's more to this kind of rhythm of cycles of 7. One of the things that happens in that 7th year as well is it's a year when you cancel all debts. So in a sense, when someone borrows money from you, they only borrow it for 7 years, and after 7 years, if they haven't managed to pay it back, it's just cancelled. It's kind of like, we'll just rip that up and we'll start again. There's a sense in which there's a kind of 7th year, a Sabbath year for those who loan money. But the most amazing thing I think that happens in Israel in this kind of rhythm, I guess this rhythm of work and rest, which is this kind of like 6+1 rhythm that God institutes, is that every seventh year, so every 49th year, after 49 years, there's an entire redistribution of wealth across all of Israel imagined. So what happens every 49th year is that someone blows a big old ram's horn because something really important is going to happen in this 49th year. So 49 years have taken place on this rhythm of 6 years of work, 1 year of rest, 6 years of work, 1 year of rest, 6 years of work, 1 year of rest, through to the 49th year where someone blows a ram's horn. And then what happens is that everyone returns to their original plot of land, So when Israel enters the land is distributed amongst the tribes of Israel and amongst the individual families. And if you like, every family has a little bit of land which is enough to live off. So it's enough land to provide for their family. But you know what happens after a few years? Someone gets a little bit poor. Someone kind of like hits some hard times. Maybe someone gets sick, and as a result, they can't really work the land in those 6 years, and so they sell a bit of land to someone else. And so there's another family that sort of takes over a bit more land. And so what you find is that over a period of this rhythm of 7 times 7, that the land is redistributed as a result of the kind of stuff that happens, things like natural disasters or sickness, or just maybe a few bad choices that someone is involved in, that as a result that the land looks quite different after 49 years than it looked at the beginning, that it's been naturally, if you like, kind of redistributed in a much more uneven kind of way. So rather than every family having their plot of land, there's some families that have got absolutely shed loads of land and some families that have none. So some that have had to sell themselves into slavery, if you like, to become servants. All they have is their labor to sell. They don't have the land, which is the means of production. And so what happens is there's a ram's horn that blows, and it's kind of like everything. The pieces are all thrown up in the air, and the land is redistributed to Israel, so that everyone once again has their land back and has a fair crack at it, a fair shot at providing for their family and for those within their community, because the land is redistributed. In Israel, and this is the real sense, I think, in Leviticus, there's this incredible sense, I think, in which that idea that we're stewards rather than owners is like structured into the way that the law is set up within ancient Israel, so that literally you're a steward rather than an owner, because ownership is just imagined as a term of 49 years. You can only ever own anything for 49 years, in a sense. What you do when you buy someone's land is you kind of buy a few years. It's more leasehold and freehold. It's kind of like a 49-year-old max leasehold, which you purchase. And you know that after 49 years, the just and right thing is about to happen, which is that all the land goes back to everyone, because the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. It's not stuff that I own. It's stuff that someone else owns, that God owns. And it's kind of amazing, I think, this picture that's drawn up in Leviticus, where, in a sense, I think God really plays out within this new community that's enjoying living in their own land. He just implements a set of laws and structures which remind them ultimately that they're stewards, not owners, and remind them to look at others with a particular set of eyes, which is to see others as made in the image of God, and others as having as much a right to the land as they do, and as much an opportunity to provide for their families as they do. There's a strong sense, I think, and you really get this, and I think we'll see this with when Tom talks about the prophets, that God structures injustice, not charity. Like, he doesn't say to Israel, oh, it'd be really nice if every now and again you who become massively wealthy give a tiny bit of that money away. He says, actually, what I'd really like is a structure in society so that everyone has an equal shot at it. And that actually over a period of 50 years, over a couple of generations, there'll be a sense in which inherited wealth disappears, and that there's a kind of reset, a restarting of the clock, and a redistribution of wealth in an even kind of way, so that there's this kind of rough pattern of equality, not as a kind of political point scoring, but as a sense, I think, in which for God, justice really matters way more than charity. That God doesn't really care about things like charity. Actually, what he cares about is about fundamental ideas of justice, because everyone is created in his image of equal value. And so there's a sense in which that value, that sense of value, has to play out in the way in which Israel is economically oriented as an agricultural society in this position. And I think there's a resonance to that, isn't there? There feels something wrong about a slave trader philanthropist to us in Bristol, to lots of people in Bristol, that I think deep down inside, I think we know that justice is more important than charity. That I think deep down inside, we recognize that a slave trader philanthropist is a bit of an oxymoron, and that actually maybe justice matters way more than charity. That's, I think, part of the kind of sense of us being made in God's image, is that we kind of get it, that in a sense that's the story of our city at the moment, is a city where large parts of the city get that story. We kind of resonate with that sense in which justice matters more than charity, that God's call is not just for a few people to become massively wealthy through exploitation and then to give a little tiny bit of money away, but actually that God's call is for justice to flow like rivers and righteousness to pour down like ever descending streams. But there's a kind of but in this, which is, does Israel ever do this? Does Israel ever rest? You know, because it sounds fantastic, doesn't it? To just imagine if you worked 6 years and then rested for one. And just imagine if every 49 years there was a kind of reset button where inherited wealth would suddenly disappear and the kind of privileges that come with inherited wealth would suddenly disappear, and that all people made equal in the sight of God would be restored to that natural kind of shalom peace of living in the land in that way in which I think Genesis story imagines it. Just imagine if that could happen. I think Israel cannot imagine this would happen, because they say, hang on a bit, like what's going to happen in that seventh year? So, okay, here comes God, and he comes God with this grand plan. God says, oh, I've got a great idea. What I'd love you to do is not just rest one day in 7, but I'd love you to rest for a whole year in 7. And Israel says, hang on, what are we going to eat in that 7th year? Like, already there's anxiety rising. There's like a kind of pressure in the chest, which is that this does not sound like good news. This sounds like bad news. This doesn't sound like a promise. This sounds like a threat, which is that already there's a kind of catastrophizing going on, which is like, this is year 1 and I'm already dreading year 7, because year 7 is going to be terrible. I won't be able to feed my family in year 7. This is like a really bad idea. This isn't wise. This is foolish. Because I need to work. I need to work all the time to be able to provide for my family. And this is plain stupidity to suggest that for a whole year I would just leave the soil to do its own thing, because I don't think the soil will produce enough for me and my family. You know, in some ways, one of the things I guess you can see with the Old Testament law is you can almost like rationalize the Old Testament law through a modernist lens and say this is great ecological wisdom. You know, we know that leaving land fallow is a smart thing to do. It's something that has emerged. And you know, if you did O-level economic and social history back in the 1980s, you'd have learned all about crop rotation and Turnip Townsend. And we know that that happens, don't we? We know that actually it's smart not to exploit the land, that everything that agricultural scientists and the ecological movement teaches us is that there's an awful lot of wisdom about letting land rest. And that's something that is kind of traditional agroecological wisdom in indigenous societies. It's something that's rediscovered in the 18th century and becomes a sort of staple of agricultural practice, that it's really good to leave the land fallow. But what happens within our world is that we decide, oh, we'll leave one field fallow every 4 years or every 7 years, but to just leave all the land fallow for 7 years is just plain stupid. Because what happens in that 7th year, if I leave all the land fallow, is I might starve to death. And that's what Israel fears. Israel does not take this as good news, the invitation to rest, but it presses all their buttons, all their insecurities, all their anxieties, all their fears, because they don't think there'll be enough food to eat. And God comes back to them with this amazing phrase, I think: be assured that I'll send my blessing for you in the 6th year, so the land will produce a crop large enough for 3 years. When you plant your fields in the 8th year, you'll still be eating from the large crop from the 6th year. In fact, you'll still be eating from the large crop when the new crop is harvested in the 9th year. Be assured that I will send my blessing. Be assured that I will send my blessing. As I was thinking about this stuff, in many ways, I think when I was thinking about law, I was really drawn to the stuff around, the idea of Jubilee, around this kind of 7th year and this 49th year. And I genuinely do think that one of the things that you see within the Old Testament law is that God cares way more about justice than charity. Like, God doesn't primarily set up Israel as a sort of like, oh, there'll be loads of rich people who'll give a little bit of money to poor people. He wants something much more profound and deep rooted than that. Like, he wants everyone to have a chance to enjoy this world that he's created. And what he wants for this community is he wants shalom, peace. He wants a whole community, not a fragmented and fractured community. I really think the Lord does teach that. But as I was thinking about this text, the thing that I was drawn to this response of Israel, which was that invitation feels like a threat, and that actually what rises up in Israel is fear and anxiety, fear of not having enough if they let the land lie fallow for 1 year, fear of not having enough if they allow God to redistribute lands on a 49-year cycle. And the thing I was drawn to more than anything was God's words, be assured that I'll send my blessing. There'll be enough. There'll be enough not just for the 7th year, but also for the 8th year and for the 9th year. The God of quail and manna says to Israel, as they move from being this wandering tribe who are dependent upon hunting and gathering up quail and manna that falls on the land around them, as they move to working the land, God wants from them the same relationship of trust that's characterized the years of wandering. And he wants that, I think, because it's only when we trust that we're able to be generously selfless with others and to live in a right relationship, not just with God, but with others around us and with the land itself. I really love this quote from Elizabeth O'Connor, who talks about how when we're afraid, that's the moment that we can't be selflessly generous, that fear is our biggest challenge and our biggest problem. It's the biggest threat always, not just to our happiness, but I think also to the happiness of others. In some ways, you could do a series like this and say, God cares for the poor, so we should care for the poor too. But actually, I feel like what God wants to do with us is he wants to take us to a deeper restructuring of our hearts, that he wants to do like a deeper work in us, which is, I think he wants to invite us not to be afraid, that he wants to deal with the stuff that deep down inside is the thing that actually hinders us in being generously selfless with others, in responding to the needs of others, because so often it's our fear of not having enough that holds us back from selflessly spending ourselves on behalf of others. That at root, I think, our problem is not that we don't understand the biblical story, it's that we don't understand the biblical God, who's a God who comes to free us of fear. That I think that's God's invitation to Israel, is not to be afraid. That I don't think in this passage, I don't think he's just saying to Israel, oh, here's a really great idea to redistribute lands. I think he's saying, this is a really great idea. You don't need to be afraid. You can trust me. You can trust me. I'll provide. I'll bring blessing. You could live a whole new kind of life that's a life rooted in trust of God. And once you experience that, then in a sense, everything else flows from that. Everything else changes as a result of experiencing faith, not fear, experiencing trust, not anxiety. And that, I think, is God's call in the law, is to a relationship of a generous father to his children who no longer need to be afraid. And that's my sense of this text, is I do think this text, the law, I think, does say justice, not charity. I think God does justice, not charity. But I think ultimately, I think what God invites us to is to trust, not fear. That's his invitation, I think, to us today, this week, this month, this period, as individuals, as Bristol Vineyard, is to say, guys, you can trust me. It's going to be okay. It would be okay to take a year off, because I'll provide. it would be okay to do ... because actually I'm sufficient, I'm big enough for all of that. And in a sense, I think that's my invitation to us this week, is if you want a bit of homework this week, is to do a bit more of an audit. And this is a bit of a terrifying audit. In some ways, it's a scary audit. But I think sometimes it's good for us to pause and to in a sense, take a moment to ask, where am I afraid? Where am I anxious at the moment? And then to invite God to bring his faith into that area of our lives, and for God to speak those words from Leviticus: be assured that I'll send my blessing for you. Be assured that I'll send my blessing for you. You know, one thing I'd love us all to try and do this week is to take a bit of a moment just to be honest about, where am I afraid? Where am I fearful at the moment? And where do I need God to speak those words to me? Be assured that I'll send my blessing for you. Because I think that's where God can break fear and anxiety. And then I think we can live. Then we can truly live. Then we can live lives as selfless and generous people. So it's a scary invitation this week, but it's an invitation maybe just to take a few moments to think about, okay, well, where am I afraid? What's the thing I'm fearful of? Am I fearful of death? Is that the thing where I need God to say, be assured that I'll send my blessing? Am I fearful of what's happening in my kids at the moment? Is that where I need to hear God say, be assured there I'll send my blessing? Is it where I'm fearful of making do, of getting through this next stage of life? Is that where I need to hear God say, be assured that I'll send my blessing? Because I get this sense with this stuff that we're doing at the moment, that I think God doesn't just want to say, I care about the poor. I think we also need to hear God saying that I care about you as well. And that as we grasp that, then I think also we can start to live lives that increasingly care for those that God cares for. So there's more homework. I'll post it up on the Facebook group. Thanks, guys, for being so good at doing the homework in the last few weeks. And I hope this homework is stuff that we'll be able to do individually, but also in a sense do collectively as a community, and invite God to speak into those places where we're anxious and fearful, and to bring his peace and to bring his blessing, and enable us to live.
Thank you, Tim. That was great. That was so good. I think my initial reaction when I read those verses about the seventh year was exactly the same as Israel. I was thinking, well, what will they eat a whole year? That's bonkers. So I think, yeah, really great to then come back to thinking about, okay, well, how can we trust God? If God says to do something like that, then we can be assured of his blessing. And so I think let's just take a moment now just to have a little think and a pause, to think about those questions that Tim's just asked. Where are we afraid? Where do we see darkness in our own lives, in the people in our families, in our close families, our wider families, maybe our communities? Where do we need God to break through and bring his light? Father, I just pray that you would, as we are still before you now, that you would just bring to mind areas of our own lives or people that we are close to where we feel afraid and where we feel that actually we just need your light to break through. We need to hear your voice saying, be assured.